Now tell me, children, have you ever thought about what hurts a man the most? It's not poverty, not even hunger. The greatest pain is when your dignity is stripped away in front of the very people you love. The old man's voice trembled as he leaned back in his wooden chair. His two grandsons sat quietly in front of him, wide-eyed, sensing that their grandfather was about to share a story different from the others they had heard before. His eyes carried both the weight of sorrow and the fire of pride. Welcome to Revenge Depth, the channel where betrayal, justice, and the sweet taste of revenge come alive. Here we bring you powerful stories of broken trust, painful humiliation, and the incredible strength it takes to rise again. If you've ever been wronged, if you've ever been underestimated, this is the place where your pain finds a voice. And your courage finds inspiration. Now, let me take you into my story. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my daughter's life, the old man continued, his tone low and steady. The wedding hall was glowing with lights, laughter filled the air, and my daughter, my beautiful girl, looked like a queen in her bridal dress. Every father dreams of such a day. Every father wants to see his daughter smiling, stepping into a new chapter of life with dignity and respect. He paused, his hands tightening on the armrest of the chair. But fate had written something else. That day became the darkest memory of my life. The grandchildren leaned forward. The old man's voice cracked as he went on. The groom, my daughter's fiancé, the man who was supposed to protect her and respect me as her father, he took the microphone to give a speech. I expected him to speak of love, of commitment, maybe even thank me for raising the woman he was about to marry. But instead, he humiliated me in front of everyone. The old man swallowed hard, reliving the wound. He looked around at the crowd, then pointed to me and said, "This is my father-in-law, an unemployed loser, a poor old man who has lived his entire life achieving nothing. Even today, he stands, here only because of other people's support." The words cut deeper than any sword. The hall burst into laughter. Some people looked away, ashamed for me, but most laughed at a man who had given everything in his life for his family. And in that moment, I felt my entire existence collapse. My daughter's eyes filled with tears, the old man whispered. She looked at me, silently apologizing with every trembling glance, but she could do nothing. That was her wedding day. For her, it was supposed to be joy. For me, it became humiliation. He looked at his grandsons, his gaze sharp and unyielding. But remember this, children. A man's worth is not measured by money or power. It is measured by his strength, his patience, and his dignity. That day I stayed silent. I did not answer him. I allowed the hall to laugh at me, but inside my heart, I made a vow. A vow that this insult would not go unanswered. The grandsons exchanged anxious looks. One of them finally asked in a hushed voice, "Grandfather, what did you do next?" The old man leaned forward, a faint, almost dangerous smile tugging at his lips. "That," he said, "is the story I will tell you now. A story not just of betrayal, but of how a broken man rose again. They thought they had destroyed me that day, but in truth, that day was the beginning of my revenge." The old man sighed deeply, his gaze fixed on the flickering lantern in the corner of the room. His grandson sat still, afraid to even breathe too loudly, as though the silence itself carried the weight of his memories. After that day, he began slowly. I walked out of the wedding hall with my head bowed but my heart burning. The laughter of those people echoed in my ears like cruel bells. I had never felt so small, so crushed, so invisible, and yet I said nothing. I let them think I was weak. But children never mistake silence for weakness. Silence is where storms are born. He clenched his hands together as if holding on to the fragments of that painful night. When I reached home, I sat alone in the dark. My daughter was gone to begin her new life, and I should have been at peace. Instead, My chest was heavy with shame. I kept asking myself, had I really failed? Was I truly a useless old man? He shook his head, his voice sharp now. No, I had worked my whole life. I raised my children with my bare hands, sacrificing my own dreams so theirs could live. If money was the only measure of success, then perhaps I had little. But if love, sacrifice, and honor meant something, then I had already lived a richer life than most. His eyes glistened in the dim light, and his grandson saw not just pain, but pride returning to his face. But still, he continued, the insult stung. It stung because it came from the man who had promised to care for my daughter. If this was the way he mocked me in front of a crowd, then what would he do to her behind closed doors? That thought haunted me. The children leaned closer, and the old man lowered his voice as though confessing a dangerous secret. That night, I made a decision. I would not confront him with anger or fists. No, men like him thrive on provoking weakness. Instead, I vowed to rebuild myself, to show not only him, but the entire world, that dignity cannot be stolen, it must be defended. For weeks, he explained, he lived quietly, avoiding gossip, ignoring the pitiful looks from neighbors. He worked in silence, waking early every day, taking small jobs, saving every coin. People whispered behind my back, he said bitterly. They said the old man has lost everything. They laughed when they saw me carrying bricks, sweeping floors, doing the work young men wouldn't touch. But every drop of sweat was not humiliation. It was fuel. Every insult was not defeat. It was sharpening my resolve. His grandson's eyes widened. They could see the determination in his voice even years later. One evening, the old man went on, I passed by the house of my daughter and her husband. Laughter spilled from inside, the sound of guests celebrating. And there he was, the groom, the one who mocked me, standing tall, proud, speaking as though he owned the world. I stood outside for a moment, watching. I didn't feel anger anymore. Instead, I felt something stronger, patience. I knew my time would come. A time when his pride would collapse, and the same crowd that once laughed at me would laugh at him. The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, filled with quiet fire. Children, betrayal and humiliation are not the end of a man. They are the beginning of his rebirth. The world thought they buried me that day at the wedding, but what they didn't know was I was a seed. And seeds grow into trees that cannot be cut down. His grandsons sat frozen, their young hearts pounding. They could feel that the story was only just unfolding, and the storm their grandfather hinted at was still waiting to strike. The old man finally leaned back, closing his eyes. And so, he said, that was the first step of my journey, the step that turned humiliation into determination. And children, once a man makes such a vow, nothing in the world can stop him. The old man's voice grew steadier now, as though the anger of the past had sharpened into wisdom. His eyes carried both pain and pride as he looked at his grandsons. After those days of silence and labor, life began to test me in new ways. You see, when a man is humiliated, people begin to measure him differently. Neighbors who once greeted me with respect now offered pity, as if I was less than them. Even shopkeepers looked at me with eyes that said, "Here comes the useless old man." But I never argued, I never complained. I let their pity feed my hunger to rise. He shifted slightly, his hands clasping the arm of the chair, knuckles whitening. One morning, I was working at a construction site, my hands raw, my back aching, when I overheard two young men whispering. They said, "Look at him, once respected, now just another laborer." His own son-in-law called him a loser. Perhaps it's true. Their words cut deep, but instead of breaking me, they pushed me harder. I decided that day I would not die with their words carved into my memory. No, I would rewrite the ending myself. The children sat still, their eyes glued to their grandfather's weathered face. I began saving every coin I earned. At first, it was nothing more than a few crumpled bills in an old box. But little by little it grew. I reduced my meals, I worked longer hours, I walked instead of riding buses. Every sacrifice was a brick in the wall I was building against their mockery. You must understand, children, revenge is not always about striking back with fists. Sometimes it is about building yourself so strong that your very existence becomes the answer. His eyes narrowed, recalling the turning point. One day, opportunity knocked. A friend from my past, an old companion from the market, saw me carrying bricks. He asked, "Why is a man like you breaking his back here?" I shrugged, but he pressed further. Finally, I told him my story. He listened carefully, then leaned closer and whispered, "Come with me tomorrow. I have work that matches your dignity." I followed him the next day, unsure of what awaited me. He introduced me to a small business owner who needed a trusted man to handle deliveries, accounts, and customers. It wasn't grand, but it was honest work, and it paid better than the construction sites. More importantly, it gave me a chance to prove my worth again, not just to others, but to myself. The old man paused, a faint smile tugging at his lips. With time, I earned respect in that place. Customers trusted me, the owner relied on me, and slowly my savings grew. I was no longer invisible. I was climbing step by step, though no one around me knew the storm I was preparing. His grandsons exchanged glances, their young minds struggling to imagine their grandfather as anything but the strong man before them. But fate has a way of testing you, he continued grimly. One evening, after finishing work, I crossed paths with my son-in-law. He was stepping out of a restaurant, surrounded by his colleagues. He spotted me in my simple clothes, carrying a bag of groceries. His lips curled into a smirk, and loud, "Enough for everyone to hear," he said. "See? Still the same old loser." His words drew laughter from the group. The old man's fists tightened on the chair, his voice trembling with restrained fury. In that moment, I wanted to lash out, to shout, to strike, to make him choke on his arrogance. But children, sometimes the greatest strength is restraint. I said nothing. I simply looked at him, and then I walked away. But as I walked, I made another vow that the day would come when he would choke not on my silence, but on the success he thought I could never achieve. The room fell silent again, the old man's breathing heavy, his grandsons hanging on every word. "And that, children," he whispered, "was the spark that turned my pain into fire, the fire of revenge that would burn until justice was done." I still remember that night after the wedding reception, when the laughter of guests had faded and only the echoes of their words remained in my mind. The words of my son-in-law still pierced through me like a sharp knife. "Unemployed loser." It wasn't just an insult. It was a public declaration that I was worthless, spoken in front of strangers, relatives, and even my own daughter. I sat alone, staring at the empty glass of water on the table. The weight of silence was crushing. My daughter came to me with concern in her eyes, but I forced a smile. "Don't worry," I said. "It's your big day. Forget about everything else." But deep inside, I was burning. A fire had been lit, one that no insult could extinguish. You see, people often mistake silence for weakness. They assume that if a man doesn't shout back, he has nothing to say. But silence can be more powerful than a storm. I decided that night I would not confront him with anger, nor would I create a scene. Instead, I would let time reveal who I truly was. The following days were filled with celebrations, but my mind was already planning. For years I had hidden my achievements, my sacrifices, and even my struggles. I had lived a life where pride was never in boasting but in working silently. And now that silence had been taken as failure. I remembered the empire I had once built, the business I had nurtured from scratch. I had stepped away, not because I was incapable, but because I wanted a simpler life. I had entrusted everything to those I believed were worthy of carrying the legacy forward. But little did I know that in doing so, I had painted a picture of weakness in the eyes of others. As the days passed, I began to notice more. My son-in-law would speak proudly about his boss, about the power and respect he commanded at work. He would flaunt it in conversations, almost as if reminding me of my supposed insignificance. Each word added fuel to the fire inside me, but I stayed calm. Revenge, my child, is sweetest when served at the right moment. One evening, I visited an old office building, one I had not stepped into for years. The security guard, who still recognized me, straightened his posture and greeted me with respect. Walking through those halls was like walking back into my past. Employees, old and new, still spoke my name with reverence. That moment reminded me I was never truly forgotten. I made a decision. I would return, not to prove myself to the world, but to remind my own family who I really was. Quietly, I reached out to old partners, former colleagues, and loyal workers who had always believed in me. To my surprise, their respect hadn't faded. They were ready, even eager, to walk beside me once more. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, my son-in-law continued his arrogance. He would talk down to me, make subtle jabs, and present himself as the successful man, while painting me as the old, dependent father. My daughter, though uncomfortable, stayed silent, perhaps caught between love for her husband and respect for her father. But inside me, patience grew alongside determination. For revenge is not rushed. It is cultivated, like a seed waiting to sprout. I knew the day was coming when the tables would turn. When the man who mocked me as an unemployed loser would stand frozen in shock, realizing he had underestimated the wrong person. And I was ready. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. On the surface, life continued as normal. My daughter settled into her new home, learning to adjust to the habits of her husband. Yet beneath that fragile surface, I could sense the cracks forming. Respect is the foundation of every relationship, and when respect is missing, even love begins to suffocate. My son-in-law's arrogance grew with each passing day. Whenever we met, his tone carried the same sharpness as on the wedding night. "You wouldn't understand," he would say during family conversations, dismissing my thoughts, as though experience had no value. He spoke with pride about his boss, about his success, about the wealth he was building, always with the unspoken comparison that I was nothing. But what he didn't know was that behind the quiet smile on my face, I was already weaving a plan. I had begun to revive connections that he couldn't even dream of reaching. Old business associates, investors, and even rivals who once respected my strategies. Each conversation was like adding another brick to the fortress I was silently rebuilding. One evening, I invited an old friend to my modest home. He had been one of the earliest partners in my journey decades ago, when I first began my business empire. He looked at me with surprise. "After all these years, you want to step back in?" he asked. I smiled. Not for pride, for dignity. He leaned back in his chair, then nodded slowly. "Then let us begin again." That night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A spark, a purpose, a fire that was no longer just about me. It was about teaching those who judge too quickly that silence should never be mistaken for defeat. Meanwhile, my daughter's life was not as golden as it appeared on the outside. Whenever she visited, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Her husband's pride often turned into criticism, not just toward me, but toward her too. He demanded perfection, measured her against unrealistic expectations, and reminded her constantly of the wealth and status he was chasing. She tried to hide the pain, but a father always knows. One afternoon, while I was in my study, she broke down in front of me. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Father, sometimes I wonder if I made a mistake." I held her hands gently. "A mistake is only permanent. if you accept it as your destiny. But if you choose to rise, life will always open another door. Her words strengthened my resolve even more. This was no longer just about my humiliation. It was about showing my daughter that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves in silence, striking only when the time is right. The turning point came unexpectedly. At a grand corporate event, my son-in-law proudly introduced his boss to the family. He walked with his head high, his arm linked with my daughters, presenting himself as if he were already among the elite. The hall was filled with lights, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. And then fate placed me face to face with the man everyone called the boss. To my son-in-law's horror, the boss froze when he saw me. He immediately stepped forward, bowed slightly, and addressed me with deep respect. "Sir, it's been years since we last met. I didn't know you were family." The entire hall went silent. Eyes shifted from the so-called successful husband to me, the man he had mocked as a loser. My son-in-law's face drained of color, his pride crumbling before everyone's eyes. I didn't need to say anything. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. That night, as I returned home, I looked at the stars and whispered, "The game has only just begun." The silence of that night echoed longer than any applause. The humiliation my son-in-law suffered in front of his colleagues and his boss was something no amount of wealth could erase. But I did not rejoice in his downfall. Revenge is not about gloating. It is about restoring balance, dignity, and truth. The very next morning, the phone calls began. Old partners, investors, and even some of the corporate leaders who had once walked away from me years ago were suddenly reaching out. Word of the event had spread quickly. They remembered who I was, and more importantly, they remembered what I had built. One of them said over the call, "We always respected you. The markets may have changed, but men like you never lose their touch. If you ever decide to step back into the game, we'll stand behind you." For the first time in years, I felt the weight of being underestimated lifting from my shoulders. My so-called weakness had turned into quiet strength. I wasn't the unemployed old man my son-in-law had mocked. I was a storm waiting to rise again. Meanwhile, the tension in my daughter's home grew unbearable. After the corporate event, her husband's mask of pride had shattered. He returned home furious, lashing out at her for something she had no control over. "Do you see what your father did?" he shouted. "He embarrassed me in front of everyone." My daughter stood silently, tears welling in her eyes. He mistook her silence for weakness, but in truth, she was realizing something he had never understood. Respect is not given by force, but earned through character. She visited me the next day, her voice trembling as she told me everything. I listened quietly, my hands folded, my mind clear. "He has not only disrespected me," I said, "he has disrespected you, and that is something I will not allow." What my son-in-law never knew was that his boss, the man he worshipped, had once been my student. Decades ago, I had mentored him, guided him through his first ventures, and taught him the very strategies that had made him powerful. The respect he had shown me at the event wasn't out of politeness. It was genuine gratitude. Soon after, I received a private invitation from this same man. He wanted me to return, not as a guest, but as a partner in his newest venture. It was a golden opportunity, one that could restore everything I had once built, and more. When I walked into that meeting, heads turned. The boardroom was filled with young executives, including my son-in-law. His face turned pale the moment he saw me seated at the head of the table, a place he believed belonged to men like him. The boss introduced me firmly. "Gentlemen, this is the man who shaped my career. From this day forward, he is not just a consultant. He is our senior advisor, and every strategy we implement will pass through his hands." The room erupted in applause. My son-in-law could barely clap. His arrogance had blinded him from the truth. The man he had mocked was the very foundation of the empire he was desperate to climb. When the meeting ended, he cornered me outside, his voice shaking with anger. "You think this changes anything? You're still nothing compared to me." I looked at him calmly, my voice steady. "No, son, this changes everything. You see, respect isn't earned by showing off wealth or titles. Respect comes from character, from sacrifice, from years of proving yourself. You tried to take my dignity away. But dignity is not something anyone can steal. It lives within." His words faltered, his eyes darting away. For the first time, he had no reply. That night, as I sat with my daughter and grandchildren, I felt a strange peace wash over me. The story wasn't over yet, but the tables had already begun to turn. I whispered to myself, "The sweetest revenge is not destruction. It is rebuilding stronger than before." And deep down, I knew the final chapter was drawing closer. The days that followed were like watching the tide slowly turn. For years, I had carried the weight of silence, letting others believe I was just a fading man with no place in the new world. But now, the truth was surfacing, and those who once overlooked me were beginning to see me again, not as a forgotten figure, but as a force they had underestimated. My son-in-law, however, was unraveling. The humiliation he had faced in front of his boss still haunted him, and my presence in the boardroom became a constant reminder of his arrogance. Every meeting we attended, every plan I advised on, was a silent blow to his pride. He tried to argue against me, to discredit my ideas, but the board only respected me more. Each time I spoke, people listened. Each time he shouted, people turned away. At home, his frustration grew poisonous. My daughter began to confide in me more often. She told me about his temper, his endless complaints, his desperate attempts to cling to control. "Father," she said one evening, tears in her eyes, "I don't know if I can endure this anymore. He no longer sees me as his partner, only as someone to blame for his failures." I placed my hand over hers. "Child, listen carefully. A marriage built on respect can survive storms, but a marriage built on arrogance collapses under its own weight. You must decide how long you're willing to carry a man who refuses to carry himself." Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate in the corporate world. His image as a confident rising star was crumbling. The same colleagues who once admired him now questioned his leadership, especially after his reckless decisions began costing the company money. The boss, who trusted me deeply, often consulted with me privately. "Your son-in-law is unstable," he admitted. "His pride blinds him, but your wisdom brings balance. I need you here." Those words carried a weight I did not take lightly. For years, I had thought my role in shaping the future was over. But here I was, not just guiding a company, but quietly teaching a lesson that arrogance always destroys itself. One night, my son-in-law confronted me directly. His voice trembled with anger, though I could see fear hiding behind his eyes. "Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to ruin me?" I looked at him with calmness only age can bring. "I am not trying to ruin you. You ruined yourself the day you called me worthless. The day you forgot that respect is the foundation of every success. I am not your enemy. I am your reflection. What you see in me is everything you lack: patience, integrity, and humility." He stood there, frozen, unable to answer. His fists clenched, his pride screaming for a response, but his voice had abandoned him. My daughter, who overheard this exchange, stepped into the room. For the first time, she stood firm against him. "You humiliated my father, but in truth, you humiliated yourself. I cannot live with a man who sees value only in titles and money. If you cannot respect him, you cannot respect me." Her words struck him harder than mine ever could. He stormed out of the house that night, slamming the door behind him, his footsteps echoing with the sound of a man losing everything he thought he controlled. As I sat with my daughter afterward, I told her gently, "This is not the end, child. Sometimes life must break apart before it can be rebuilt. You will rise from this stronger than before, and he will learn that no empire can stand on arrogance." The final act of this story was fast approaching, and I knew that when the curtain closed, there would be no doubt left about who truly held power, not in wealth but in dignity. The wedding hall had grown silent, as though time itself had stopped to witness the final moments of this confrontation. All eyes were on me, the man once mocked, dismissed, and labeled a worthless loser. Yet here I stood, not only reclaiming my dignity, but exposing the arrogance of those who thought their wealth and titles could buy respect. The groom, pale and visibly shaken, no longer carried the smug smile that had once defined his face. His father-in-law's jaw tightened with shame, realizing the truth that could no longer be hidden. And my daughter, tears brimming in her eyes, looked at me not with pity, but with pride, a pride that words alone could not capture. I did not need to shout. My calm, steady voice carried through the hall louder than any anger could. Respect is not measured by money in the bank or the titles on your business card. Respect is earned by how you treat others, by the honesty of your actions, and the strength of your character. The silence deepened. Guests who had once laughed along with the groom's cruel words now lowered their heads, ashamed of their silence. They too had been complicit in allowing cruelty to pass unchecked, and now, in this moment, the balance was restored. I turned to leave, my steps unhurried, my back straight. The hall erupted, not in mockery, but in applause. It wasn't a celebration of wealth or power. It was an acknowledgement that truth and dignity still held meaning in a world so often blinded by appearances. Later that night, as I sat with my grandsons, their curious eyes fixed on me, I told them, "Remember, this day not as a story of revenge, but as a lesson. Life will test you, people will mock you, some will underestimate you. But never forget, the loudest answer you can give is to live with dignity and let time reveal the truth. Those who belittle others only bury themselves in their own arrogance." They nodded slowly, the weight of the story settling into their young hearts. It was not just a tale for them to hear, it was a lesson for them to live. And so, the story came to an end. A story of betrayal, mockery, and redemption. A story where the tables turned, not through anger or violence, but through patience, dignity, and truth. And so this tale reached its conclusion. In the end, it became clear. Those who look down on others end up humiliated themselves. Let this be a reminder. Respect cannot be bought, it must be earned. This is Revenge Depth, where we bring you stories that shake your heart and leave you with unforgettable lessons. If you want to hear more gripping tales like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters to us.